I'm so glad that you're here. My name is Alex Crum, and I am on staff at the center. I help out with some of the stuff there at Grandview. I've also been through some of the programs that we're going to be talking about today, and as a student, and so I'm excited to be here and kind of be kicking us off and getting hosted. I have the privilege of having all of the etiquette and tech conversations at the beginning for all of you. So we are recording this, so please be aware of that with whatever you're doing with your camera on or off in the background. This is going to be recorded and distributed, so act accordingly. Please mute yourself unless you're talking so that we can keep a nice clean audio for the recording, and also so that we're not interrupting anyone. We will hold probably most of the questions until towards the end of the conversation, but please utilize the chat too if you have any questions as they come up, to throw them in there. If there's something particularly pertinent to the moment, I might kick it over to Dr. Matthew Leavenworth and let him answer that question in the moment. But we will have a time specifically set aside for questions at the end, and if that spills over into after the call, we'll have some time after the call for questions as well. So please utilize the chat for that. What we're going to do, sort of the agenda for our time together, is going to start with Dr. Paul Leavenworth. Not that that's going to get confusing, but Dr. Paul Leavenworth is going to share a little bit about what is compassionate listening, the history of the center, and a brief explanation of sort of what we've been doing, what all this research and stuff is based in and around. And then most of our time is going to be spent with Matt, kind of hearing about his findings, the research that he did, all that kind of stuff. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Paul to give us a little bit of information on compassionate listening and the center, and a brief explanation of the certificate. And before I do that, I'm actually going to drop in the chat right now. This is just for posterity. A link directly to our website at Grandview, in case you have any interest in looking into anything related to the center at another time. There it is. Save it on a tab or something for later. But there it is. Okay, so here is Paul.
Greetings. I am the proud father of the presenter, Dr. Matthew Leavenworth. I am the founder and the director of the Center for Mentor Coaching and Leadership Development at Grandview, and I see many of you who have been a part of that. So I present as the director of a team, and I thank you and appreciate you for linking in and for all that you do. So compassionate listening, I'm just going to share the why, the how, the what, a little bit of history about the center, and just a very, very brief overview of our certificates. So the why of compassionate listening is caring enough about another human being to hear the story within the story. And we believe that love is the universal language, and that across culture, people are wrestling with one or more of three questions. Who am I? Why am I here? And what am I supposed to do with my life that matters? So that's the why. The how, we train people in active listening, which is open-ended questions, summarization, followed by powerful questions. Discovery learning is an educational approach where people take the responsibility to solve their own problems. And so we provide a compassionate context using active listening to allow people to discover insights into their own life, and then ultimately action plans so that they have an opportunity to rewrite their story in a more positive, empowering way. And then we use what's called the IDEA methodology in terms of our mentor coaching. The I refers to introduction. So I'd go, Alex, how are you doing? The D, the D refers to discovery, and I'd ask Alex, so what do you want to talk about? So the person that we're working with really drives the conversation and drives the agenda of the relational process. The E is exploration. So I would ask Alex, so what one thing would you like to discuss more deeply? And then the A is application or the action plan. And so I would ask Alex, so what one thing are you prepared to act on, and how do you intend to do that? And the action plan is critical to what we've discovered about the power of compassionate listening, in that it allows people to break out of being maybe stuck in their thinking about themselves and their options, to empowering them to take steps in positive and transformational ways. And so then the what of compassionate listening is becoming a better version of yourself and a more effective leader in your spheres of influence. So that's the why, the how, and the what of compassionate listening. The center was founded at Grandview University in February of 2021. It emerged out of a pilot course, BSGR 574, Mentor Coaching and Leadership Development, in Grandview's Master's of Science program in Organizational Leadership. And since then, primarily through word of mouth, we have had the opportunity to impact a lot of people. It's been pretty amazing. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but we are serving people in the context of religious organizations, public education, higher education, nonprofits, for-profits, possibly government agencies. We're in the midst of writing a proposal right now. So there seems to be a need out there. And we are committed to providing high quality training at a reasonable price, so that anybody who has the capacity to grow in compassionate listening, compassionate leadership, and building compassionate communities can be involved in our training. So that is kind of the overview. Our certifications involve certificate in mentor coaching and leadership development, and then secondary certifications in small group facilitation and consulting. So our plan in terms of expanding is that it's okay to get big as long as you stay small. So we have been able to identify people with the capacity to facilitate and be mentor coach supervisors in our process. So we do things as teams, and we have developed teams. We keep our cohorts fairly small. We can have multiple cohorts going at once because we've got great people who are committed to this whole process. So kind of with that, I want to introduce my son, and he's going to share about his dissertation, The Lived Experience of Transformation of Mentor Coach Training.
Thanks. So I'm not sure, Dad, prior to this, you've ever called me Dr. Leavenworth. It's kind of fun. And, future forward, my preference would not to be called that, but, the novelty is not worn out quite yet. So thanks for that. And it's cool to, I don't know, honor that experience. It's been a long journey getting here, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Sarah, I just wanted to say, I think your husband is awesome. And I'm really glad that you made it on here. So it's great to meet you. I hope we meet more formally in the future. But yeah, thank you guys for all you guys do for the center. So I'm gonna screen share here, and I'm gonna kind of screen share some and then take the presentation off. I've got this kind of massive PowerPoint. It's like 40 slides, and there's just stuff all over it. And I would much rather talk with you and talk to you, because if I have the presentation up, I really can't see you guys. And so I'm going to put it up some, and then especially in the results section, when I talk about the results, I'm going to pull it up because there's a lot of quotes, and there's the direct experiences of the participants in the research project. But I'm going to just pull this up, and just to give you an idea, because the first thing I'm going to do is just to talk about my background and how I decided on this project. The second thing is to really explain what a dissertation is and what that process looks like, because it's really, really relevant to why this specific piece of, set of information is important. That a dissertation, it's a research project. It's not a novel. It's not a biography. It's not a lot of those different types of things. And so understanding that research project and what went into it is really critical in understanding why it is that this information matters and why it's relevant, and also where it's not relevant, because there are certainly many domains in which this doesn't apply, or questions that this research doesn't answer. So it's really important to have that background. And so this is sort of the overview, and a dissertation is usually formatted in this frame. So it's chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the first chapter is the literature review. And that's where you really look at the evidence body that's out there. And as it turns out, there's a ton of stuff on mentoring and coaching. Mentoring and coaching, it's a monster of a field. It's a huge field. It's a huge industry. So then chapter 2 is the methodology, and that is the specific steps. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but what went into producing the data that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Chapter 3 is the findings, and that's actually the results of this process of research. And then chapter 4 is the discussion. It's sort of why it matters. And most dissertations are formatted similarly to this. Some will be 5 chapters, some will be 6, but a lot of them are 4, and they're formatted very specifically in this way. And they're not like, outside of research, they're not super fun to read. I know a few of you folks have read it, and I'd be curious as to what you think, because it isn't a novel. It's not something that's presented in that way. It's presented as research for researchers. And so I'm just going to kind of talk to you guys. So I'm going to get rid of that. But I think that is a really important thing that I want to emphasize here. So this presentation sort of marks a transition of pre-dissertation Matt and post-dissertation Matt in relationship to the CMCLD. Because this is a research project, and because I've really had to remain neutral, unbiased, that I've really had to be a researcher, that has eliminated my capacity to have some other roles that I might have had with the center. So I haven't had a formal role as a center. I don't see mentor coaching clients. I've helped out a little bit with some of the teaching stuff, but I've really kept that separate. And so the reason for that is so that I could be a researcher, so I could be an objective researcher. So when I interviewed the participants, if they told me that they hated the CMCLD and they didn't like their training, that's what I would have written down. And it's really important to distinguish that, because, and especially my specific research project, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, like that's what has to happen. That's what makes research valid. That's what makes research credible, is that I really am trying to hear from the people I'm interviewing and really tell their stories. And so post-dissertation, post-PhD, Matt is a huge advocate for the center. I think that what is happening right now is unbelievably profound, and it fills this enormous need in our society. I think that fundamentally there's been a breakdown in people's capacity to listen to each other, that our country has fundamentally stopped listening to each other. And so this is a methodology, and it's packaged in this incredibly simple way, where that's what we teach people how to do, is to hold space for each other and listen to each other. And so the future Matt is an advocate, an ally, and hopefully an instructor and a mentor coach supervisor and a lot of these things. And I truly hope to be very involved with the center, but there's a very marked distinction between these two phases in relationship to the CMCLD. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about specifically what a dissertation is, what research is, and the methodology. And there's like a bunch of big words in this first part. And then after that, we'll get to the part where we really talk about the stuff that's as far as I'm concerned, really, really interesting, which is the stories of the participants. But so a dissertation is a research project, and it falls into 2 categories, right? There's 2 types of research. One is quantitative and one is qualitative. And so quantitative is numbers. So quant, it's numbers, it's statistics, it's running hard data and hard numbers. And in a PhD program, you have to learn to do both of those things. And then when you get to your dissertation, you have to pick either quantitative or qualitative. Qualitative is a little bit like softer research, but it's focused on stories. It's focused on really because there's a lot of things that numbers can't tell you. They can't tell you rich contextual information. They can't tell you, what's really going on in a person's life. They can't give you a sense of who somebody is behind those numbers. And so there's a lot of reasons to do quantitative research, and there's also a lot of reasons to do qualitative research. And so I am I'm a counselor. I am a mentor coach. And so qualitative for me is a natural fit. I love hearing people's stories. I love getting to know people. I love listening to people. And to me, stories are like the most beautiful thing on the face of the planet. And so, I found that in counseling, and I found that in coaching, and I found that in this research process as well, that what I was after was capturing the beauty of the human experience. And I think that if you do read the dissertation, I think that's really, really in there. And that's probably the thing that I'm most proud about as far as this project. And so I'm going to rewind just a second here and talk a little bit about how I came to this research project. So I've been a counselor for 10 years, and I would say that my professional career and my dad's professional career ran parallel, but didn't really overlap up until about 2 years ago. And so I had become a counselor. I mean, it was like 12, 13 years ago that I went through my master's program. And I had this experience, especially in we called them intensives, but they're this in-person, just grueling process where you get interviewed. You have to be a counselor. You have to get counseled. There's people watching you. You can fail the course. And I just had this radical, like, it was the first time I'd ever had somebody just hold up a mirror in front of me and just had this. I mean, it was awful. It was a terrible experience that was also a freeing, liberating experience once because I think that's at the heart of transformation, is you have to get blown to pieces before you can really start to put yourself back together. And so for me, it was this unbelievably transformative experience that then allowed me to grow as a counselor and become the counselor that I became. And actually, the person that blew me to pieces wound up being my dissertation chair, which is, he just kept doing that throughout my PhD process. That trend actually never really ceased. But sometimes those are good things. There are pieces of us that need to die. There are things that about us that need to break so that we can evolve and we can grow. And so I was able to then hold space for clients, for patients in a counseling setting. And I did that for about 10 years. And I love counseling. I deeply love counseling. I've seen people grow. I've seen people heal. And that's why, I went back to get my PhD in counselor education. And then it was maybe about halfway through that my dad asked me to do the certification process. And, I was real busy, and it was like, man, I guess I can try. And I wound up doing it with Alex, and Dad kind of took us on our own independent track. And just because both Alex and I have some background experience, we were able to kind of, work our way through it. But I discovered something really powerful about the center, and it's what really got me interested in the first place. In that this thing that makes counseling tick, that makes it work, that makes it a healing profession. It was present in the CMCLD. Like the certification process had the marrow, the meat, the stuff that really changes people, but it was packaged in 6 to 9 months, as opposed to a 60 credit hour program with 1,500 hours of supervision. Like becoming a counselor is just like, it's an enormous undertaking, and it doesn't pay very well. And there are tons of things that counseling does really, really well. And it does some things that mentoring and coaching don't do very well. But extracting out those things that really make us connect with others, which to me, like the counseling process is a human process. It's a relational process. And the fact that he took those things out and packaged them in a way that we could just disseminate was fascinating for me. And then all of a sudden he launches this program, and he starts taking lots of people through it. And all of a sudden, like, my dad went from, professor, like he wrote a bunch of books, but to all of a sudden, like, owner and operator, founder, director of a fully functioning center in like a couple of years. And all of a sudden there's like 100 people that have gone through certification. And to me, it was like it was a true phenomenon. And it was something that I just was really fascinated by. And so anyway, those are the experiences that sort of merged into why I selected this as my dissertation project. So then kind of go back into what a dissertation is, and specifically what this dissertation is. So this is a qualitative dissertation, which is it's aimed at human stories, at human experiences. And there's even there's an umbrella. There's a lot more different types of, there's grounded theory, there's case study, there's narrative. And so there's all these different forms. This dissertation is called an IPA dissertation. So it's an interpretive phenomenological analysis. And so that is a specific type that's really aimed at capturing the phenomenon of experience. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what an IPA dissertation is. And then we're going to move on to the stuff that is actually quite a bit more interesting. But it's really important to know this background, because this methodology. So when we talk about research, good research is called rigorous. And rigorous means that you've definitively followed these very specific steps, because my research, especially this research, and I got a ton of feedback on this from my professors and had my feet held to the fire over 100 times at least, but was problematic for a number of reasons in that inbuilt was a potential for bias. Like, this is my dad's program. This is, it's close to home. I'm a certified mentor coach. So I got a lot of pushback when I selected this as a topic. But what protects this information is specifically this rigorous process, is going through IRB, is going through, you have to do a dissertation proposal. Like, you just get reamed for like a year and a half as you write this thing. And if you do a good job, that actually fine tunes and hones the information that you wind up with. And so that's the outcome. And you have to wind up getting 3 doctoral signatures on the piece of paper on the front, and they make it very hard to get those signatures. So this research is rigorous, and this research is the product of me stepping outside and really truly trying to hear stories. So IPA is 3 things, and I'm going to just kind of briefly explain, and this will be the last thing, and then we'll go into the findings. But it's idiographic, it's hermeneutic, and it's phenomenological. I still can't say that word even after 2 years of trying. But idiographic means that it's focused fundamentally on the story of the individual. So the individual is the universe of the research, and there's no piece that can be divorced from the individual telling you that story. So when I sat with somebody and listened to their story, they were the expert. Their words mattered far more than my thoughts, my feelings, my beliefs. It was truly about their story and capturing their story. So that entire rigorous research process is aimed at capturing that individual story. Great to see you, Bree. So the second piece is that it's hermeneutic, and hermeneutics it's a fancy word, but it's a fairly complex thing as well. So hermeneutics, it's oftentimes associated with like biblical excavation. And so my best story, and this is where I knew might get in trouble with Richard Webb if he watches this later, but my best explanation of what hermeneutic is there's a passage in the New Testament where Jesus tells you that it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle. I probably messed that up too, but that, you think about that and you're like, that's interesting. Well, I guess it would be hard for a camel to get through an eye of the needle. And you're like, oh, okay, well, it sounds like it's really hard. And so you sort of move forward, but the eye of the needle was actually a passageway into Jerusalem. And it was a very low passageway where you had to like actually stoop. You had to like get down and you had to get low. And camels won't do that. And so you really can't understand what Jesus truly meant or the wisdom in those words unless you understand that. Like, he was actually talking about how difficult it is to stoop, how difficult it is to get low for a rich man. And that's what actually makes it difficult for him to get into heaven, him or her. But that's the excavation process, that you can't really understand those words unless you put them in context, unless you really understand the environment in which they were spoken. And so that's what it means. That's what hermeneutic means. And in qualitative research, we talk about the hermeneutic cycle. And that's like, dad tells me something, I say it back to him, he repeats it. It's like this game of telephone. Then I try and write it down. Then he looks at it, and that's the hermeneutic cycle. And every time that happens, you're losing information. And so IPA methodology is specifically designed to try and get the information, or just get as close to. And some of the founders like Heidegger and Sartre, and there's a whole bunch of other, their position is that you really can't actually get, like, we may not even be truly aware of our own experiences. And so for an outsider to get to really capture somebody else's experience is an impossibility, but we can get as close as we possibly can. And then phenomenology is the last component of this. And so this was truly a phenomenological study. But my example for what phenomenology is I use the story of a baseball. And so the baseball, it's manufactured, it goes down the assembly line, and it's, it's $5 or $7 or whatever it costs. And then it goes to a professional stadium. And then that ball is thrown, and Barry Bonds hits the final home run to break all of the records that have ever been set before. And each time, each movement, the baseball is changing. Like, the baseball is now a different baseball. And then we find out that Barry Bonds, was using steroids the entire time. And so his record is retracted. And now the baseball itself has changed once again. And so that's the best explanation I've come up with for what phenomenology is that you really have to understand, like, that you can't just divorce numbers from the people that they came from. And so all of these things go into what this dissertation is. And so now I'm going to pull up a little bit here and talk about some of the specifics of this dissertation. And that's kind of the process where all of this stuff came from. And I'm going to go through this stuff as quick as possible. But I want to talk a little bit about the research gap. And so the research gap is like, because you don't want to repeat research. So you really want to do research in the unknown. And so this research project, so I'm a counselor and my PhD was in counselor education. And so this research really was for the field of counseling. And counseling doesn't really understand mentoring and coaching. And there's actually like a fairly negative perception of coaching, which is another area that I got quite a bit of pushback on this as a potential project. But there isn't a lot of research that is from the perspective of counseling, and there isn't a lot of research that really understands what mentoring and coaching are. And also, mentoring and coaching are these enormous fields. Like there's an estimate, and if you really want to know about coaching, I really recommend the ICF Global Coaching Study. It's like 2020, and it's even bigger now than it was. But that estimated coaching at like a $4 billion industry. It is a monster of an industry, and it really exists at the highest tiers of society. So corporate coaching is massive. Like there's almost no Fortune 500 CEO who doesn't have a coach. So it's this the really massive phenomenon that is functioning really in similar space to counseling. So that was one of the big things. Also, there was no research that I could find that looked at the transformational experience of training. And that's somewhat different than, so in my dissertation chair, he looked at the transformational experience of counselors in training, which is actually what I went through, which is another kind of background component of why I found this so fascinating. But there isn't anything that looked at the training process. There was literature and research that looked at the transformational process of being mentor coached, but it's all client driven. So this is a pretty unique project in that respect. So the research question I started with was, what is the lived experience of transformation for mentor coaches trained and certified through the Center for Mentor Coaching and Leadership Development? And the research explores what it means to become a better version of yourself and a more effective leader in your sphere of influence. And so this research sort of put that claim to the test. And this will be important later, but I used a really specific definition for what transformation is. I called it a lived experience that involves deep change, increases self-awareness, and affects multiple dimensions of a person's life. So that's the litmus test. Like that's what transformation looks like, at least as far as this research is concerned. And so that was kind of what the interviews sort of functioned around. And so the purpose and the significance really was to take a look at mentoring and coaching from a counseling perspective. And chapter 4 really delves into the nitty gritty of why this is really relevant to my field and the field of mentoring and coaching. And so I just want to talk briefly about the background too. So the background of mentoring and coaching and transformation is, I use this word, it's like sort of the Wild West. And I actually found that term in the literature as well. But mentoring and coaching, they're not well regulated. There are 500 different definitions of mentoring. There's 700 different definitions of coaching. There are 30 different definitions of transformation within mentoring and coaching. And so there's just this enormous body of fairly unregulated research, and it's a really new field as well. And so it's just not super, super well understood, and everything's a little bit scattershot. And so that's kind of the background this is coming into. And I would say also the other background too is that my field is not equipped to deal with the rising level of need, especially in as far as mental health. Like there is a crisis right now in our nation and in the world. It is a global crisis, but the mental health needs are just rising. And Joel, you know that, man. You deal in addiction, like many of us here, like we are face to face with the radical need that is out there, and counseling isn't going to get it done by itself, although it's a huge component of that. So my proposition was that we really need to look at all of these other helping professions that potentially can be an asset in our a fight against mental illness and our drive to make the world a better place. And so just very briefly, this is coaching and mentoring. And so we're talking about mentoring and mentor coaching, which is a term that's fairly unique to the center. The center sort of takes those things and puts them together. But the lead foot really is coaching. And so coaching, not to be confused with coaching your high school soccer team or something like that. Coaching it's about creating space for somebody else. It's about sitting with people. It's about asking open-ended questions. Whereas mentoring is much more facilitative, and it's much more didactic, and it's about sharing your knowledge. And so the mentor coaching model really has both of those aspects to it. And in mentor coaching, we talk about taking off one hat and putting on another hat. And so the lead foot is always coaching, is creating space, is asking open-ended questions, is discovery learning, is the idea methodology, is compassionate listening. But every once in a while, it's like you really see something that needs to be addressed. And so you put that mentoring hat on. And that is like, boy, I've got some life experience. And that life experience tells me that, you know, like I'm going to share this with you. A couple other things too, compassionate listening. That's the term the center uses in the coaching world. There's pretty much listening is a component of all coaching, I would say. Less so mentoring, but mentoring as well. And then transformation, there's a huge body of literature on that as well. Mesereau was the founder of transformational learning theory, and that was pretty important, at least in the dissertation process. So Dad did a great overview of what the center is, but that is something I also attempted to encapsulate in this project as well. This is what the center is. It's what it does and it's what it stands for. This is the mission statement. And I think something that really drew me to the center as well is that coaching is sort of, there's an elitist backdrop to it. So it's like, you know, Rice University or corporate CEOs, or those are the people that coaching is primarily for. But Dad has really extracted that out and taken these skills, which, man, they're so powerful, and then package them in a way that we can take and then distribute to the people who really need it, to nonprofits, to churches, to, you know, like, and that's part of the mission statement is high quality training for anybody that needs it. And that to me is really exciting, that we can extract this out from, you know, extract these skills out from, you know, maybe counseling, and extract these things out from the corporate hierarchy and then give them to people who are operating in the real world. And I really think we can make the world a much better place by doing that. This mission it's incredibly important. And so the methodology, so there's an entire chapter about IPA, and I am not going to talk about that anymore. So unless you want me to spend another, you know, if you want to stay on here for an hour. My original plan was just to read this verbatim, just word by word, in as monotone a voice as possible. I'm just kidding. I also have a dancing cat later on in the presentation. So you have that to look forward to. I was worried this might be a little bit boring, so look forward to the dancing cat. All right, so I'm just going to play this, and I won't be able to see you guys now. So Alex, if anybody has any questions, but this is the stuff that I really want to talk about. This is the background of how this came to be. And so I'm just going to pull up this, and so I won't be able to see you. Alex, feel free to interrupt me. I don't mind answering questions at all. So please ask if you want to. So the findings. So what I did was 2 individual interviews and a focus group. And the focus group had 6 out of 7 of the participants. But so I interviewed 7 people, and I did it twice each time. And each of those conversations lasted about an hour and a half apiece. And then you do something called coding, which is you really extract information out and you look for themes. And it's called cross-case analysis. So you look for what is common across the stories. But the first and foremost thing, and this is the ideographic component, is to really capture what it is that person tells you. And so this is my favorite part about the entire dissertation, is that I created narrative accounts, which is a little bit of my own thing in the IPA context. But I wrote out the stories that were told to me. And so all 7 of the participants, there's one of these, I call them narrative accounts for each of the individuals. And, you know, they're about 10 pages, but it really is. And I decided this sort of late on in the dissertation process. It was because the stories that were told to me were so beautiful and were so meaningful and were so human that they almost demanded to be told. And I would have done a disservice to my project if I had just extracted out the themes and said, this is what was common there. And I really think that these things need to be read in tandem together. To understand the themes is also to understand the stories. And to understand the stories is also to understand how those themes were come to. And so the first part is these narrative accounts, and they truly are my favorite part of this entire project. And then the second part is the thematic analysis, and that's what we're going to talk our way through. So there was 5 themes, and we'll go through what those 5 themes were, as well as a bunch of sub-themes that were really organizing structures of what this transformation meant to the individuals that experienced it. And that's the other thing about phenomenology. So I was looking for 7 people who actually experienced transformation. So I'm not looking for 7 random people. I'm not looking for 3 people who experienced transformation and 4 that didn't. This really is about 7 people who expressed to me that the experience at the center was transformational. And I had 3 criteria. One was that they experienced it as transformational. The second was their level of training. And then the third was diversity of experience. And that to me was very, very important in this project too. So they had to be using the training, they had to be using the material. And then I also wanted people from different socioeconomic statuses, different racial and ethnic backgrounds. But to me, like, if this is actually transformational, I wanted to hear it from not just, a bunch of corporate white guys, like not just a bunch of people from the nonprofit sector. I wanted to hear it from as diverse of a group as I possibly could. And I think that that was achieved in most senses. But it was, I think, one of the things that really made this rich. So these were the 5 themes, and we're going to go through them and I really wanted to share the screen here because I wanted you to see the quotes, because this is what was actually told to me. And this is what I based all of this off of. So the first theme was that this was transformational, and very specifically transformational in relationship to the definition that I used, which was that it's a lived experience that raises self-awareness, involves deep change, and affects multiple dimensions of a person's life. And so you can see that stuff. And even Trish's that quote, what I learned from the training is unless there's a real heart change and a desire, you can have an outward obedience, but it's not going to lead to a lasting change. And I think certainly it helps me understand God's love. I think that's what is kind of interesting. I knew this had a faith aspect, which certainly interested me, but I don't think I went into it thinking the whole foundation of my thoughts and faith would change. And so to me, like when I think about transformation, especially what she told me encapsulated that. She told me a story about like prior to getting involved with the center and going through this training process, it was her relationship with God. And she perceived God as maybe judgmental, maybe critical, like this harsh version of God. And as she experienced this space that was held for her in the training process, and as she worked on herself, and as she took that hard look in the mirror, and as she wrestled with her belief system, on the other side, she was able to embrace a more loving, more compassionate, more forgiving God. And then that was internalized in a way that then she was able to reflect out into the world with others. And so that takes to the next one, which is what I thought this one really has to do. And the first 2 have to do very specifically with the center's training. But the center is set up in a certain way. So the transformation as an individual and a practitioner. So there's this duality in the transformation that I described, that I heard from the participants. And the center's training is really set up in this way. So the first half of the training is really about self-reflection. It's really about understanding yourself. You have to do things like a timeline. You have to meet with a mentor coach and actually experience space being held for you, and wrestle with yourself and like come to grips with who you are and deal with your pain and your past and your trauma and really wrestle with all of those things. And as a counselor, I found that to be fundamentally true as well, that's what I do is I hold sacred space for other people. Like that's my job. I hold that space, and it's vulnerable, it's sacred, it's intimate space. And I have absolutely no business whatsoever doing that with other people if I haven't been willing to go there myself. And I think that's built into the center, whereas there's an expectation of self-exploration. And so that's part of the transformational process. But then the second dimension is giving people the skill set to then go and create that sacred space with others. And it really is, there is like a first half and a second half in the training. And the first half that's what it's dedicated to is really self-reflecting, really understanding who you are, why you're doing this, like where it is you want to go, your personal life mission, like who you are as a person. And then the second part is the skills of compassionate listening, which again are this discovery learning, it's the idea methodology, and it's active listening. So those 3 components. But then, so not only have you gone through the process of being mentor coached, but now you have that skill set to then take into really all of the dimensions. And that's, again, that multidimensional application. And I think that this is very consistent with the claim of the center, that the center will make you a better version of yourself in every dimension of your reality. So it makes you a better husband, it makes you a better wife, it makes you a better leader, a better coworker. And it really does. Like if you can learn to listen to people and really hear the story within the story, it makes you a more effective salesperson. Like you can understand what it is that drives people by listening to them. And so there is this dual nature, and this dual nature is very present in all of the other themes that were described. So transformation is a growth process, and this was a really important one, and one that was very, very heavily emphasized. And so even just to start with this, and heavily emphasized by all of them, and probably the most common and recurrent theme. So I just put the words process in bold, italicized, and underlined. I think that's huge in this conversation about transformation. It's a process, and it's usually a messy process. And I even wrestle with, can you ever really be done with your transformation? I say that while being in the middle of one, so I don't know. Maybe I'll get to the point where I'll be like, okay, my transformation is done. But I think it might be more like, okay, that hill is done, but my transformation is still going on. And to me, that speaks to what transformation really is. I mean, I think we'd all really like to think that, you know, you just do a couple of things and then transformed, like, nah, I'm good. And you're better on the other side. But that was certainly not present in the descriptions of the people that I talked to. That it's a growth mindset. It's a way of being with reality, where you understand that even your failures, even the things that didn't work out the way you hoped that they would, all of those things come together to they're part of the learning process. And I think a transformed person embraces the messiness of reality and knows that much of life is 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and knows that, yeah, like, and one of the participants gave me this analogy, but she's a teacher, and she draws, like, this is A and this is Z, and like, how do you get there? And she asked her students, and, you know, like most of us, well, yeah, you draw a straight line from the other one, but like, instead she draws like this, you know, crazy squiggly line that hopefully deposits you to that other place. But that's what transformation actually looks like. And I think that's really consistent with the stories that were shared. So theme 4, and to me, this was absolutely one of the most important themes in this. And it was that this is a relational, that mentoring and coaching is relational. It's fundamentally driven by a relationship. And so that's the most, like, I think healing comes from that relationship. That relationship it's the place. It's holding space for somebody else, and that other person trusting you enough to walk through their pain and walk through their messiness, and also just this idea that it's the answers aren't yours. You're not the person, like, you're not there in that space to just give them the answers. Like, you're in that space to just be with them in their pain and their anguish and their triumph and their excitement, and I think all of those things were just very, very well articulated. And that, I think, is very built into the center training, is that we're not problem solvers. We're not fixers. That's what we're there to do, is to walk through life with other people. And maybe we have some wisdom that we can share and we put on that mentor hat, but primarily that's our job, is to know that life is messy, to know that it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and to continue to hold that space and continue to hold accountability and continue to drive that person forward by believing in them and empowering them. And so I like that the quote by Ronald. Going through that session with him was huge, and he was talking about a really critical moment in his development, and it actually resulted in him going to get a master's degree. And it wasn't even the content; it was the conversation that I had with him, and it was the relationship that we've built over the years, where when he does speak to me, I listen, and I listen very intently, and I really chew on the words, because I know that he's coming from a genuine place, and it's out of love and not out of, and I know more than you. And that was very, very fundamental to these relationships that were described by the participants, is that there were all of these truly relational qualities, and you have to think about them that way, like trust, compassion, vulnerability, like these things that only really can occur like when there's a true foundation of a relationship for all of the rest of the actual work to take place. And so all of that stuff is described as walking beside, as walking with, as leading from behind. And those were some of the recurrent aspects of what this relationship is. But I think really understanding, and all of those things are fairly accurate in counseling as well. And so the last one, and I think this one really speaks to what transformation is. And it also speaks to the literature on transformation. So it connects back, and it is maybe the most abstract or ethereal of these 5 themes that came out of this. But that transformation, it's a narrative of death and rebirth. And so in the interviews, I used the prompt of the phoenix. And there's a number of other prompts I could have used, but I used the phoenix very specifically. One is, everybody knows what the phoenix is. And 2, it's a sort of a mythological symbol of what transformation is. But the phoenix dies, it burns into ashes, and then is reborn as a new, more beautiful, more brilliant bird in the aftermath. And so that was all I introduced as far as what transformation was into the conversation. And that became sort of a motif that was very consistent throughout the interviews. But there was, even another quote on here that one of the other participants said, like, man, everybody has their time in the barrel. Like, and I think that's so true of the human journey, and so true of the stories I heard. I mean, I was told stories about, people losing loved ones, and people losing their jobs, and divorces, and just all of these things that can be so catastrophic in our lives, and we have to mourn and grieve, and transformation encompasses that there is a part of us. And I think back on my transformation in my counseling experience, And what that was is that mirror was held up for me, and I had to look at the thing in me that needed to die. And like it needed to die because I was not going to be able to grow into the professional that I needed to grow until that thing died. And killing a part of yourself or letting a part of yourself die is really painful work. It's really, really hard stuff. And so that knowledge that, like, because the center claims to be transformational. So I think it's really important that when we talk about what transformation is, we understand that we understand that this is radical growth. This is a reforming of who you are. And I think it does take this kind of space to be held for other people to really get at the marrow of who you are and who you want to become, so that you can become the best version of yourself and the best leader in your sphere of influence. And there's also a couple of components to that too, because there's the narrative death, but there's also what I would it's being under the waterline, and that's an analogy that's used both in the center. It's used in counseling. You find it a lot, but it's these experiences where it's like time sort of stands still, and you're in it. You're in your stuff. You're in your baggage. You're in your world, and you're just forced to sit there, and you're underwater. It sort of feels like you're drowning, but like that's the space. And if you've been there, or if you've been through this process, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like, because it's extremely intense, but you're there, and you're there with yourself, and you're there, and you have to work through what it is that you need to do to grow. And so that was very present in all of these accounts as well. And so those were the 5 themes. And maybe I can pause there, and we can I can figure out how much time I've got left, because the next chapter is the discussion, and it's what all this stuff means, why it's relevant to counseling, why it's relevant to mentoring and coaching. And there's probably a few points that I really want to touch on, and then I will conclude here. But maybe I just pause. Alex, is there any questions that have been coming through?
No questions yet. This is your 10-minute warning on Q&A. So if you do have questions that are percolating, please drop them in the chat.
But I still have, so I have 10 more minutes, and then we have Q&A.
Yep, you got 10 minutes.
Beautiful. Hey, we're right on time. I'll just talk faster, right? As if I'm not already. So chapter 4 is the discussion. It's why all this stuff matters. And I think that there really is sort of a tension between counseling and mentoring and coaching. And there's sort of this like, whose tree is who peeing on kind of a thing. And there's sort of like a distrust kind of a thing too. So one of the things that this was really aimed at was explaining what mentoring and coaching is, what role it serves. And so there's a number of dimensions. And so not going to go through those, but like where that is, that because there is a line between mentoring and coaching and counseling. And there's a line that really shouldn't be crossed in some cases. And so the primary difference that I think really emerged is that mental health counseling is really a mental health service. And this is also taught in the center's training, and they use the quote, if you think you're out of your depth, you probably are. And so that's a really good thing to know, because mentors and coaches aren't necessarily trained to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder or bipolar disorder or some of these things that are where people or suicidal ideation. Like the training isn't there. It's not intended to be there. And so there really does need to be a line drawn. And I've even encountered the term mental health coaching. And I know some people who operate under that term. And there is some underlying concern there where people are operating out of their depth and out of their knowledge base, and they're doing things that to some degree are irresponsible. And so there's accreditation is one of the things that I really talked about. So in counseling, there's CACREP accreditation, and that's a very important component of counseling. Like, you want to look for a school that's CACREP accredited. In mentoring and coaching, there's the ICF, which is an umbrella organization that accredits a lot of the different programs. But there's also Udemy, and you can go on Udemy and take a 3-hour fully asynchronous course and print yourself off a certificate and go operate as a mentor coach. And because this is sacred space that we're talking about, because this is like you sitting and being with other people, like there is potential harm that can come to clients. And so part of the conversation that's coming out of this is we're wrestling with how to protect clients, how to protect counselors, how to protect mentor coaches, and what's the best way to do that. And the CMCLD is a really interesting middle ground, because it is a credible organization. It is a rigorous organization, but it's also not ICF accredited, which places it as sort of an outlier in this spectrum, this Wild West reality of what mentoring and coaching really, and how they function and what that means. So knowing where those lines are drawn is really, really critical to the future conversation. So this is one of the really interesting things, I think, that there's this research body called Common Factor Research, and it's especially in counseling. It came from counseling, and a lot of what mentoring and coaching is came from counseling. Counseling has a much longer history than mentoring and coaching does, and mentoring and coaching borrows very frequently from the body of knowledge, from the canon of knowledge in counseling, and that's fine as far as I'm concerned. But it is so Common Factors Research came from a number of folks, but it looks at what the core ingredients of a healing relationship actually are. And so a lot of those things that emerged in this research, and especially under that theme for the relationship of trust, vulnerability, of active listening, of all of these types of things, that there are common factors. And so this research body is emerging in mentoring and coaching that also attributes therapeutic healing and mentor coach healing to what are common factors. And so understanding what those things are. And so like in counseling, there's CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, there's psychoanalytic therapy, there's behaviorism, there's all of these different modalities, and they all claim to be the most effective. And so what Common Factors counseling and mentor coaching research looks at is what is it that actually leads to healing? And so there's quite a lot in there. But and so I'm going to go with this quote by Brandy. People feel so isolated, and it's so powerful to simply say, hey, you're not alone. There are other people that feel this way, and be able to help them through that process. I was just thinking that while Amy was talking through her explanation of community, just the importance of knowing that other people feel the same way you do, and it's okay. James was talking about vulnerability, and that's important too. Like remembering as a leader, it's important for me to be vulnerable when I feel like it's an appropriate time. It helps with other people open up and not feel so isolated in their feelings, like they're not alone. And to me, that idea of sitting with people, of holding space for other people, it's that place where we stop feeling alone. And to me, that is one of the major motifs. That's one of the, that's actually what makes these healing relationships effective. And knowing that it's not a formula that you just apply to somebody else. Like you have to do life with somebody else. Like you have to get into the trenches with them. And sometimes you have to bleed with them. And that's actually what produces the kinds of outcomes that could be considered transformational. So ethics and dual relationships, that's another big discussion too. There's a lot more protection in counseling for clients, I would say, than there is in mentoring and coaching. And that's back to that sort of Wild West phenomenon. Accreditation, that's also an ongoing debate in mentoring and coaching. The last kind of point is that that training is uniquely transformational. And there are all these dynamics in training that aren't necessarily present in other types of healing relationships. So a healing, like a therapeutic relationship, I hold space. Like I can't hold you that accountable. But in a training scenario, you can give them a grade. You cannot pass them. They have to do things in front of other people. And so there are these unique dimensions. And when I think about my own transformation in that room as it collapsed on me, a lot of that was because all of my peers were sitting there looking at me while my baggage was out on the table. And it was a unique and exceptionally painful experience for a lot of those reasons, but also probably a catalyst for transformation. And so that's that final question of whether or not counseling and mentoring and coaching are going to be competitors or collaborators. And my guess is that they'll be a little bit of both. And my hope is that the friction between the fields enhances both, and we're better able to serve the people who really need to be heard and seen and listened to. And so those are, again, just the 5 themes. This is kind of what was extracted out of that. And I'm happy, again, to send this to anybody. I want to read these. I've got 3 quotes here, 2 from some scholars that are some of my favorite, but really get to the essence of why it is that what the center is and what the center has to offer matters so much. But this is David Brooks from his new book. Above almost any other need, human beings long to have another person look into their face with loving respect and acceptance. It's that we lack the practical knowledge for how to give each other the kind of rich attention we desire. And then another one from Brene Brown. A deep sense of love and belonging is an irresistible need for all men, women, and children. We are biologically, cognitively, physically, and spiritually wired to love, to be loved, and to belong. When those needs aren't met, we don't function as we're meant to be. We break, we fall apart, we numb, we ache, we hurt others, we get sick. And to me, that just speaks absolute volumes about the crisis in the world right now. That human beings were just born with this need for attachment, this longing for being with others, and it isn't being met. And I deeply believe in both counseling and the mentor coaching process as their methodologies that help us see each other, and their methodologies that help us hear each other. And they're the things that we need to do if we're going to heal the deep wounds that our country currently has. And so I mean, I have a hard time reading this particular passage without tears coming to me, because I truly think it's so beautiful. But this encapsulates what it was that I heard from all 7 individuals. And so Beverly said, I remember driving over this mountain pass and everything was charred, like everything was black. This is the Pacific Northwest, where things are usually green and beautiful. I was driving and I could start to see brand new shoots coming up beneath the burned and charred ground. It was everywhere, this brand new green coming up from underneath the black. I think that's a beautiful picture of transformation. Like, yeah, things have totally burned, but these brand new, beautiful green things are growing. And if you go over the mountain now, you can tell that a forest fire has been through, but there's also so much new life, and it's covering everything. And so this is just that last kind of that pitch. We got to do this together. The needs they're too big, they're too immense. And if we don't find ways to build bridges, we're just going to fail. And so anyway, that is the last thing. And then I very frequently like to end my presentations with this, which is a drawing, a painting by Leslie, my mom. But to me, if the future doesn't look like that, then there isn't one. And I deeply believe that that's where we have to go. And it looks like that. So thank you so much. I wanted to say a few other things to you. I'm going to stop. So I think many of you know that my son was diagnosed with cancer back in July. And so I actually wrote the vast majority of this dissertation and did a lot of the research and a lot of the interviews like in hospital rooms and in patient consulting rooms. And hearing these stories, hearing people tell me these stories of what they went through, of what they overcame, it was one of the things that buoyed me through what was like at times a very terrible experience, but a rich and meaningful experience. And so I have an enormous gratitude both to my dad for the center, for this incredible work that I'm so excited to be a part of in the future, but as well as for the participants who were vulnerable with me, who told me their stories, who trusted me with their information, and it also because I think that's part of what transformation is, that like we need each other. And so yeah, I don't know, it's because I think a lot of people look at their dissertation is just brutal, but for me it was almost like a lifesaver as we went through some really, really difficult times. And I drew on those stories. Those stories gave me life, like when I truly needed it. So this presentation comes with just an immense gratitude to all of you who were involved in this process. And so glad to be at the other side. And also, I was kind of waiting. I'm going to send out my individual thank you to all the participants, but you will be receiving a copy, and it is formally published now, but it's called The Marrow in Our Bones. And it'll be a signed copy with a note of appreciation. But it's a book of poems that just walked through my experience in the hospital with Gentry. And Tanner, you got one too. I can't end this without saying congratulations to Tanner. Tanner just married an incredibly brilliant and beautiful woman. I've known Tanner for a long time, and so anyway, he's got one, but you'll be getting one soon. So thank you guys so much. It was an absolute pleasure.
All right. Incredible. We are going to have a time for questions. And I have one in the chat that I'm going to start with. And then as things go, you can either put questions in the chat or you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom to raise your hand, or you could physically raise your hand. I'll see you. That's fine too.
And I think too, Alex, like if people just want to, like, maybe let's go with the questions that are already there, but then if people just want to jump in and we can just kind of open it up.
Okay, we can do that. So the first question is from Mark, and it's based on your findings, what do you see as the next steps at macro level and micro level for counseling professionals and coaching professionals?
Okay, so macro and micro for both counseling and coaching.
Yeah.
Okay, so macro level and coaching, I think that the center is on target with where that profession needs to go. I think coaching is becoming a very defined, very evidence-based practice. Like and it is effective. Like the literature out there definitely demonstrates that coaching is very effective. What my hope is for coaching is that it becomes something that is available to people everywhere. That it becomes like, I just love, like, this is why I care. about what we're doing. I don't really care about CEOs, and I don't really care, like, that's not what gets me out of bed in the morning. I care about nonprofits, and I care about the work that is going on the streets, and they desperately need this stuff. And that's said with appreciation to a lot of the people who keep our country afloat. I mean, it's just like my particular calling is for, and I've told my dad this a bunch of times about Joel and Tim's club, that the second we stop servicing Joel and his people is the second we're off mission. And I feel that very, very strongly. And so actually I run a nonprofit called Pay Love Forward, where we take at-risk and underserved young people climbing and trail running. And I work with the LARPing community, and they're live action role playing, they sword fight, they're kind of goofballs. But for me, they're also my litmus test, that the second I stop servicing them is the second that I'm off mission and off target. So at the macro level, that's what I hope to see this contextualized to the people who need it the most, who maybe don't have some of those skill sets, yeah, I mean, there's so many stories even that came out of the dissertation, and I hope people get a chance to read it, because there's some really cool stories about how this stuff is operating in some of the nonprofits with, they don't have huge budgets, and I think that too, that this solves problems like retention that every corporation on the face of the planet is struggling with. Like, if you can't retain your employees, you bleed out, because training new employees is unbelievably expensive. And the fundamental fact is that empowered, motivated people just do better everywhere, and at every dimension in their life. So to me, it's broadening the application of coaching. I think coaching really needs to refine itself and understand itself. It needs unified definitions. Like, the ICF is probably really important, but also, like, the problem with the CMCLD and the ICF is that to become ICF accredited will drive up our costs so exponentially that we then can't service the people that need this the most. So there's kind of a paradox built into that. But so maybe we don't go the ICF route, but it is also patients need to be protected, and mentoring and coaching need to be solidified as a field. People need to understand what they are. They're just mentoring and coaching are all over the place. It's just sort of everywhere, and nobody knows what it is. Like, for example, mentoring and coaching are just used interchangeably all the time, even though they're very much different things. So yes, solidifying the profession on that end. I think counseling has developed its niche. I come from that's certainly my background, and that academic background, and there's certainly problems in that field. I think one of the macro things that counseling needs to do is figure out how to collaborate with other helping professions. So that's part of the reason that I wrote this dissertation, is they need to understand and because they're treading on each other's toes. And so understanding, reaching out, and building bridges, I think at a macro level, that's really important. At a micro level, these are just really effective modalities that the world just needs. I mean, counseling is utterly essential. And so I would say, to some degree, that's a way more complex discussion, but there's a lot of really good things happening, I think, in both of these fields that are just really, really necessary. I think that as coaches, we need to probably listen even more. Like, that would be the one, all of this stuff that Dad is talking about, like creating that space, holding that sacred space, like, don't put on that mentor hat too much. I mean, those would be, I would love to vet that out. Those are some big questions, Mark. Macro, micro, and in both, but hopefully I answered some of that stuff.
I don't know how you did that in 5 minutes. There's a whole nother dissertation there.
Yeah, there's maybe a couple of them.
Any questions from anybody else? I have one. So you mentioned that you feel like mentor coaching and counseling have the potential to continue to run into some conflict with each other in the future, but that there's some potential for growth there, and that maybe that competition can prove to be healthy. I would wonder, what do you think? Since you're coming from a strong counseling perspective, what do you think counseling has to learn from coaching, from that conflict, that would be really valuable to the already very established counseling paradigm that exists within academia and practically within the mental health world?
Well, and I think that's a really good question, Alex, and it goes a little bit back to Mark's question of where, like, counseling has the potential to tie itself up in so much red tape that it stops being attractive and stops being meaningful. And like, because it takes a really long time to get a counseling degree, and then it takes a really long time beyond that to get certified, and then it doesn't pay all that well on the other end of that either. And so we're not actually seeing that trend. We're actually seeing tons of people going into the field of counseling, but there is this tension between too much bureaucratic oversight and just the free market reality that I think coaching gets to operate in. And so there are tons of ways that we can build bridges. I mean, like, what about mentoring programs that help young students find their way into the helping professions, like especially counseling, or maybe find out that counseling isn't necessarily a good fit for them, but somebody with a lower level of training that's dealing with a healthy student that doesn't have major psychological issues, who just holds space for them. And then so I mean, I think that that is one example of a multitude of potential bridges that can be built between these fields. And I hope that counseling doesn't continue to create more red tape for itself, because there is just a balancing system. Like there are so many things about being a counselor that just are very difficult. And that goes from like billing insurance. Like, that's a big difference between counseling and coaching is coaches just don't get to bill insurance companies, but counselors do. But billing insurance companies is not all that much fun at the same time. So, one is sort of sequestered to private pay, where the other is, gets this other access to this other funding system. But those all, they have strengths and benefits. But I think there's tons of room to be able to cooperate. And I think like handoff services, like I'm a mentor coach, and it would be a good idea that I know some counselors. Like, so I'm in session with a client and they're like, I'm going to kill myself. I have a plan to kill myself. Like, you better be on the phone to a counselor immediately, because based on the training, at least based on the CMCLD training, you're not the person for that particular job. And that's okay. Like, it's okay to know what your limitations are, but it's really good. And then even on the counseling end, I've been seeing somebody for borderline personality disorder. They're no longer exhibiting these types of high levels of symptomology. Who can I refer them to? So I'm not just kicking them out on the street, because I can no longer personally bill insurance companies because they don't meet the criteria for a DSM diagnosis. And so, like, who do I hand that person off to? And I see coaching as absolutely a meaningful intervention. And so to me, those are just these ways that potentially we can build bridges and strengthen delivery of services, for everybody. And those are just ways that improve client care. And I think that has to be how we frame that conversation. Like, it has to be about client care. And the second it's about like, how much funding does counseling get? Is coaching taking our funding? Like that's the wrong conversation to have.
I don't have a question. I have more of a comment.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Leavenworth. I actually work with your father, Paul, and I've done some of the training as well. And I just want to congratulate you on this. This is so well done. I was looking through it, and when you were talking about so many aspects of things, one thing I just wanted to kind of throw in as an idea. Bridget Ernst, she recently left, but she works at Grandview as well. And one of the things that is happening a lot, as I'm sure you're seeing, as you said, in mental health, how much it's growing or the patient need is growing. In education, we are seeing a huge influx of concerns. And I work as the disability services director. So
wow.
I am seeing, I have seen my caseload go from a 90% increase in 1 year. And majority of that is mental health related, disabilities related to that, or symptoms related to that. And we're really looking at trying to find ways, like, I'm one person, to kind of do all these things. And some people have talked about building networks so that advisors have ways to support, and this group has ways to support. And I think this is really speaks to where this can come in. I know Paul has really made it a goal to try to get everyone at the university trained, but I think it would really help with some of the individuals who have those higher loads, so that other people could support in other ways.
Yeah. Well, no, I love that, Crystal, and I think, and also thank you for what you do. That's such a cool and necessary job description. Well, I think too, what's really interesting, and this is more coaching than it is counseling, but how easy it is to actually listen to somebody else, and truly how little time it actually takes. And there's so many stories, and these wouldn't be stories from my dissertation because I was looking at more of that internal process, but like where like somebody came in and was super hot, like they're mad, like their kid didn't get into school, and they're gonna like let you know about it. And then 2 or 3 really powerful questions later, the person is totally disarmed and then can can actually get out of that fight or flight mode and start solving the problem with you. And so there's all of these instances where if you actually take the time to hear somebody and see them, find out where they're coming from, you can disarm people in this truly, truly powerful way, as opposed to like, getting combative, instantaneously. And because every time that happens, it just creates a ripple effect of problems, regardless of whether you're right. It rarely matters if you are. And so I think that that's one of the really serious benefits of this is, I mean, especially the idea methodology of just like, oh, what's going on? A couple more questions where you investigate, and then what are we going to do about it together? And I love that idea of like, what are we going to do about it together? I always think that's a really important aspect of that. But you can complete the idea methodology in a couple of minutes, 5 minutes. But active, like really taking the time to hear where somebody's coming from, like you'll get somebody from a 10 to a 4 or 5, in no time at all. And so I think that, as you deal with the complexity of campus life and student life, like really building those skill sets into your repertoire can solve a lot of problems. And so I think too, also, this is one of the background questions that I think is really interesting that I didn't do for my dissertation, but we almost talked about it. But what does it take to transform cultures? And I think too, Crystal, kind of to your point, and that's part of what this is, this idea of training everybody at Grandview, of giving everybody these basic tools to hear and see others. Because that's what we really are very interested in, is what happens when an entire campus starts listening to each other. Like that is a cool question. And I think we'll see the answer. What happens if an entire church starts doing the idea? What happens if, you're a nonprofit, like all of you guys, you start really leading with listening? And I think that like, that's sort of an unknown, but it's also, man, like that's an exciting unknown. And maybe you can speak to that a little bit more, Dad. I know that you've seen that because you're on the ground operating, and you're starting to see the emergence of that as cultures really sort of embrace, that listening mindset.
Yeah, I mean, we're really at the front end of it. And so I can only talk about small groups of people that are beginning to develop what we call compassionate communities, where it's not just an individual, but together people are developing a mutuality in sharing in one another's story. And what that tends to do is build trust. And if you have a foundation of trust, you accomplish a whole lot of things. So I know Bree was on here. She works with Sylvan Learning Center. And so she's been kind of a pilot in terms of that. And then I can also refer to other organizations, religious organizations, as well as nonprofits and for-profits, where in smaller organizations, we've seen the tipping point where this is becoming more and more the way we do things together. And even at Grandview, we've trained now over 40 people in our skills training, have 10 certified with 4 more in the process right now. And many of those now are becoming facilitators and mentor coach supervisors. And so we're enlarging our infrastructure of people that can do this kind of training. And so we're beginning to see it multiply. And we have not marketed, we've just modeled it. And on a regular basis now, we're having people contacting us saying, hey, we hear that something good is happening at Grandview. Can you tell us more? So I think that's kind of our approach, is that we're just going to do it. And if it benefits, then people will hear about it. We can have discussions in terms of, again, what are your needs? How can we help you?
Well, and I think that, I mean, to at least some degree, and again, my research doesn't speak for everybody that went through the CMCLE. It doesn't speak for all coaches. It was just this specific pocket of people, but it was credible, rigorous research that shows that this process is at an individual level, like has a high potential for transformation. And so I think it is the next great question that we can't wait to find the answer to is how high can we scale that idea of a compassionate community. I would also just say, I know we're at the time that we kind of promised everybody. I'll stay along. I don't have anywhere to go. I would love to keep chatting. This is pretty exciting for me to talk about. I won't lie. I spent a lot of time writing this thing, so okay. So I will stay on as long, but I do want to be respectful of just that time.
Yeah, absolutely. We're gonna formally end this here, but by all means, Matt and Paul and I are going to be here hanging out for as long as anybody wants to chat about anything. But before we go, can we just give Matt a round of applause? I mean, this is absolutely fantastic. So good. So good. Awesome.
Gotta give it up for the old man too. You know?
Yeah.
He built this thing. I just studied it.
Good. Cool. Well, thank you for being here. And now we're moving on to the hangout afterwards.
Yeah.